My name is Avi, and we're from the University of Kent, and and so we decided to give this talk because we are stuck and lost in anthropology. So this talk is going to be about, we try to conceptualize and put into words the reasons why we feel like that, and that gave us a lot of thought. And so much so that, at the end of that, we were feeling pretty much like that. But there was also that thinking, well, it's not really good because we were still there. So basically, we're just trying to give you an insight of our journey in anthropology and try to explain as clear as we can the reasons why we're really confused and stuck. Now, a brief note, obviously, the reason why we're doing this today is because you're here, so you're our most close colleagues, so we're expecting feedback, suggestions, advices, critiques, everything. So this is just to say that, this is what we've been doing for 3 years here, but this is not what we're going to talk about. What we're going to talk about today is something that we actually don't know very well, so that's what we're trying to do, try to say what our question mark in anthropology is.
Cool. So Andrea just gave us a sort of brief introduction, and introduction is basically to say that this is not a presentation about what we know, because we've done little bits of field work as undergraduates. What we're trying to do, and it's very hard to conceptualize, is talk about something that we don't know about, which is a bit of a problem. But we shall explain what this is meant to be about. So, having studied just under 3 years, social anthropology in our cases, we realised that what we had learned had provided us with a vision of anthropology as something that has great potential to reach into many areas, to explore, everything, basically. Because everything involves human beings or different objects and actors that we're networked into. And then this was also, this came out specifically as an example, having studied genetics before myself, and going to different seminars, is that you start to see the massive gaps in methodology, in approach, and limitations in the reductionist culture of today's science. And you start to see the holistic approach is provably far more empirically strong than using a reductionist approach. If you take issue with this, you can bring it up afterwards. This was then when we started to have our problem. We realised we'd entered into the zone of what we call social anthropological arrogance. Something that I feel, if you have done social anthropology, at least as an undergraduate, you will taste it. Then we sort of got a little bit reflective on ourselves, and we said, right, so in one hand we've got the importance, this real potential that we can see, what we're doing with it. But why are we having this sort of taste of arrogance that's not really useful? Why do we have that? And that for us is because the massive size of the potential is disproportionate to the size of tangible results. And this was where we were stuck. So, how did this come about? We both did a relatively tiny bit of fieldwork, 1 month each actually, studying with fishermen in Romania and in Turkish Cyprus. And throughout the fieldwork and then coming back, what we had learned in 3 years had been cracked in half. Because what you learn about fieldwork, in terms of what you actually do, is virtually zero. All you learn is that there's something called participant observation, and that you do interviews, and that you participate and you observe. So that's fieldwork in a nutshell. I'm being a little bit harsh, but that is virtually what you do. Obviously, you get the theory, and you think about that, and you apply that as your... But in a small space of time, you're restricted into this methodology, and that was not a problem. That is fine. The problem that we got was that when, for example, this is not exactly the same in my Andrea's case, but when I came back, I felt, how do I justify spending my time with these people, but how do I justify them spending time with me? And it's not about an ethics form, which is simply, in the case, I can only speak from experience, is to try and say, well, I did the ethics form, so it's fine, I'm not taking advantage of people. The point was, what are my results going to do? What tangible, what effect are they going to have apart from me learning, apart from it being a self-centered, increasing in my ability to see the flaws in other disciplines, not understanding the world? And this was, at least in my case, where the gap between these two things stood. So then, from there, we realised that actually we were being very unfair to social anthropology, and that this was all very student angsty. And then we realised that perhaps this is because we're trying to bring in our own personal missions and ambitions into our discipline that are far, far bigger than our sort of tidbit ethnographic interests in what people get up to in their life on the other side of the world, which are interesting, obviously, but they are nowhere near as important to me, if I'm going to be honest, as to what I feel my point in life is. And we were trying to squeeze this into anthropology because we saw such a potential. So basically our question was, do the boundaries of anthropology flex enough to contain the passion of Andrea and the ambition of Abigail? And obviously we're still in the journey. But from this point, we then sort of reflexed back and we came up with sort of two areas for consideration. Well, we came up with a lot, but we chiseled it down to two important ones. And one is education. I'm definitely in the idea, the premise, the two aspects of education, is A, that these disciplinary, the boundaries are not necessarily the boundaries of anthropology. This is totally abstract, by the way, that we're feeling. But these are actually the boundaries in which social anthropology has to find itself in an academic world in order to play the part of an academic subject. So it's not that we're not being fair to social anthropology, it's we're saying that the disciplinary boundaries are actually the ones that are holding back us, putting what it means for us to live our life into the subject. And this is not my theory, this is completely obvious theory to do with how an industrialized system of education is created, which is not based on the individual or personal value systems. This is about producing someone who doesn't want to think about those type of things. That is mostly in schooling, but it emanates through university because you all share that in common in this room, by the way, most of you, unless you were homeschooled. So I'm going on a little bit, and the second aspect was this silly little question which bothers a lot of people, and that is, if you're going to understand humans, then should humans not understand what you're doing? Because that's pretty much not really happening. And a really funny thing comes up, and they are totally banal, I can never remember the word. If you ever see those memes on Facebook about different subjects, the only one I found a question mark in was social anthropology, and it says, "What does society think?" Question mark. I think that's an issue, and it can't be ignored. And following on from this, we then started doing some reading, because that's where you're going to find the answers. We found some good answers. So Andrea's going to talk about some certain aspects of contemporary anthropology, about these boundaries.
So the way we try to solve all these problems we had, which might not make any sense to you anyways, was we basically started reading Paul Rabinov, and we started thinking that maybe, while his work on the contemporary and on the emergent, and we started thinking that maybe if the education system, in the disciplinary constraints that are put on anthropology by academia, by education, they can be stretched in order for the box of anthropology to accommodate what's our point in life, which that varies between us, and the ethnographic interest that we have, because. So we thought that maybe this space that we're looking for is conceptualized, is what Paul Rabinoff calls the emerging, and the new things that he feels he has to develop new methodology and a new way to go about them. So it's basically a space for new practice, and what we're asking ourselves and you is whether that's the case, is whether that makes sense. And basically what we want is anthropology to lose all its disciplinary boundaries and remain anthropology without constraints of that education is putting on it. So the way we would go about this is, we think that from this perspective what is important is not what we do, what our ethnographic interests are, for example, but the way we go about them, constantly questioning why we're doing things, and not just focusing on not putting too much focus on just on the ethnographic interest. And then the second point is obviously trying to experiment as much as we can without being scared of saying that, because we're not assuming to be right. So if that's the case, just let us know. And however, we thought that at the end of the talk, we would put all of the questions that have been framing our talk, which is put them down for you to see what we're going on about.